Good evening and welcome to the Jazz Masterclass from New York University. My name is Dave Schroeder, the Director of Jazz Studies at NYU, and I'd like to welcome all of you here. Thank you. I'd also like to welcome everyone listening on our live webcast. In association with John Snyder and Artist House Foundation and this beautiful space, the Center for Jewish History, it's a pleasure to be able to create these series every few weeks. Tonight we have the jazz legend, pianist Hank Jones, who will be out with us shortly. But before that, I'd like to introduce one of the great jazz critics, historians, and author of the book Weatherbird, and who's also going to be speaking with me at the Blue Note Jazz Club next Saturday, the 18th, from 2 to 4. How about a warm round of applause for Gary Giddins?
Thank you. This has been an incredible series. I don't know if any of you have come to all of them, but it's been a revelation to me, and it's something that this is the last one of the season, but they're going to be back in February, and this thing is really the brainchild of Dave Schroeder of NYU and John Snyder of Artist House, and big hand there. However long this might continue, I can't imagine that there could ever put together a group of musicians like we've seen here in the last several weeks, not only among the very greatest players in the music, but among the very greatest people. I mean, musicians that you can't help but like and who convey that quality in their art. And Hank Jones is extraordinary in every way. First of all, this completely blows my mind, but he is 86. And gosh, I hope to be like that when I'm, 56, which I am. He's ageless. And not only is he personally ageless, but his music is ageless. And I mean that in the most literal kind of way. Hank, who was born in Vicksburg, Mississippi, raised in Pontiac, Michigan, the oldest of three brothers, all of them extraordinary figures in jazz history. Thad Jones, the trumpet player, composer, arranger, band leader. Elvin Jones, the primary drummer of the last 40 years, probably. And Hank, who started it playing when he was 13 years old. So that's like 1931. Think about that. He's a professional musician for over 70 years. He was playing jazz 5 years before the swing era, just a couple of years after the Hot Fives and Hot Sevens. That's how far back he goes. And he learned directly from the great players of that period when he was growing up: Teddy Wilson, Fats Waller, Earl Hines, Art Tatum. And somehow he managed to assimilate qualities of all of their playing: perfect time, very powerful left hand, wonderful lyricism, beautiful bell-tone touch. And yet you don't really hear them specifically in his music. He so assimilated it into his own style that when you hear him, you don't say, oh, well, he got that from Tatum or he got that from Teddy Wilson. Then he started playing territory bands around the Midwest, right up into the 1940s. And in one of those bands, he became friendly with Lucky Thompson, great tenor saxophonist, who brought him to New York. And he opened at the Onyx Club in 1944 with Hot Lips Page, trumpet player, singer. And from the time he arrived, everybody was aware of him, and he was in immediate demand. He played and recorded with Charlie Parker on a number of occasions. He worked with him at JATP, did 2 famous recording sessions with him. He immediately displayed the capacity to absorb, just as he absorbed the earlier players, everything that was going on in the modern jazz movement. By the time he came here, he was in his middle 20s, and he immediately responded to the new harmonies, the new melodies, the new rhythms that characterized the modern jazz movement of Charlie Parker, Dizzy Gillespie, Bud Powell, Thelonious Monk, this great little revolution that was going on. He immediately assimilated what they were doing on top of his own music. And yet, once again, if you listen to most of the recordings of that period, and most of the pianists, including the Bud Powell, maybe in some ways the greatest of all jazz pianists, at least in my taste, you're hearing a certain kinds of melodic phrases and rhythms that you associate with that period. And other pianists like Al Haig or George Wallington, guys who grew up in that period, when you hear them, you always hear those bop phrases. You don't hear that in Hank, even going back then. He's already got this very even-handed, melodic, inventive style that is just as appropriate for the swing era as for the bop era and ever since. And we have him on records now for half a century, since 1944. And his style became more mature, I think, sort of peaking in a way in the 50s. He becomes more and more accomplished in many ways, but it doesn't change radically. He's already got it down. And the incredible thing about Hank is that after all these years and in all these contexts, he always remains modern. You don't think of him when you hear him and say, well, that's the way they did it in the 40s, or that's the way they did it in swing, or that's the way they did it in the 50s. And yet everybody wanted to work with him. He played on... He was Ella Fitzgerald's accompanist for 5 years. He played in third stream contexts. He played in all kinds of modern and traditional contexts. He recorded ragtime. And in 1959, he became the first black musician to join the CBS Studio Orchestra. Now, last time I mentioned that Clark Terry was the guy who integrated the NBC Orchestra. Hank did it at CBS. And he was there for 17 years until they ended studio orchestras. And for those 17 years, he also performed a lot. He was Benny Goodman's choice pianist for most of that period. He recorded with his own groups. He was on one of the classic records on Blue Note, Cannibal Adderley's Something Else with Miles Davis. But he had the security of being involved with that studio orchestra. He played on Ed Sullivan on Sunday nights. You didn't see him probably because the camera didn't go that direction, or if it did, it only went to the conductor. For a while, there was a morning talk show. I forget who the host was, and he was the entire orchestra, and he would just be playing intros and outros for commercials. So that was a very powerful move for him to make socially, and at the same time, it was one that guaranteed him a certain amount of security. But then that ended in 1976, and then the most remarkable thing happened in his career, something that I don't think anybody anticipated. He remade himself as a major, major jazz figure, a jazz star, to a degree that he never had been before. And one of the things that did that was a company in Japan put together a trio, which they called the Great Jazz Trio, and made a series of albums. And among the rhythm sections he used were Tony Williams and Ron Carter from Miles's band, also Buster Williams, Eddie Gomez, Dave Holland, Billy Higgins, extraordinary. I mean, the absolute peak. But Hank, at this point, was, in 60. And Tony and Ron were young players, and they were among the most in-demand and sexiest players to come along since the 1960s because of their association with Miles and fusion and everything else. And I think a lot of people, just by virtue of the fact that Hank was working with them, or they were working with Hank, people sort of started to take a second look at him. And then there was another assumption when they saw that he was working with Tony and Ron, which was that Tony was the brashest, most exhilarating, exciting. I mean, he always was surrounded by cymbals, and he used them all. He created like ocean waves. And you thought that, well, maybe they would sort of rein in a little bit, for the older guy. Well, if you don't know these records, you really ought to. One of them was just recently put out on CD called Someday My Prince Will Come. They don't hold back at all. I mean, Tony never played with more vitality and drive ever than on those records. And Hank doesn't have to do anything to acclimate himself. He's already there. All the musicians recognized that there was a mutual challenge going on. And when these records came out, I think suddenly everybody realized that this is one of the great figures in jazz piano, and he had been primarily in the studios for so long that people had forgotten. Something similar happened with Tommy Flanagan, because he was Ella's accompanist for 10 years. People forgot what a great player he was. Suddenly in the mid-'70s, they both came out, and one of the things that happened was Hank and Tommy recorded piano duets. Hank also recorded piano duets with John Lewis. Just a few years earlier, there was several occasions where producers put together all-star bebop bands or modern jazz bands, and they would put, you know, legendary figure on each instrument. It would be Dizzy Gillespie and Max Roach and Charles Mingus and Sonny Stitt. The piano was always a little iffy, because there didn't seem to be any. Thelonious Monk was sort of become a recluse by that point. Bud Powell had passed. John Lewis was with the MJQ. And now suddenly it became very clear who was the great pianist. I mean, Hank Jones was completely in demand again, and yet at the same time he was playing in every kind of context. He's an extraordinary artist, and I just want to say a couple of things of a more personal nature about when you go to see him play. You're going to hear him play tonight, and this is the best way to hear him play. He's on the stage, you're the audience, everybody knows what their role is. But usually you're not that lucky, or at least very often you get to hear him play in restaurants and clubs where a lot of the audience doesn't know that that's their role. They think that they're at the Holiday Inn and the band is just the background music. And I once wrote a piece about this in The Voice when he was playing at Tavern on the Green. There was a lot of people who were talking, and there was one table practically at ringside. And man, they just had no idea that there was 4 feet away was this great artist performing. And people who came to hear the music were getting a little bugged, and finally the maitre d' or somebody walked over and asked if they could be quiet. And they looked around, and they were from out of town, and they were there as a restaurant. It was a big date. They had no idea that they were obliged to be quiet. That was not the kind of evening they were looking for. Unfortunately, some of these places don't make that clear. But what really amazed me was, and then at that point they quieted down. They had no idea why they were supposed to, because I don't think Hank's music meant anything to them. But the great thing was that Hank always plays it full force. He always plays at his peak. It doesn't matter. I remember John Lewis was once playing at the Knickerbocker, and everybody was talking. Nobody was listening at all. And I said, "How can you put up with this?" And he said, "Are you kidding? I'm getting paid to practice." He said, "This is one of the benefits. I could be at home doing this, and nobody would pay me, but I come down here for 2 hours, and if they want to talk, fine. I leave, I take my check, and I've done my work for the day." But Hank, it doesn't matter what's going on. The consistency of this man is extraordinary. I have never, in all the times I've seen him, in all the contexts, you never feel that he's phoning it in or that he's not completely involved. The ultimate total professional. I want to just call your attention to one recording that you may not know about. It's now in print on CD after a long time of being unavailable. And it's a record called The Trio. And it came out exactly at the same time as The Great Trio. Only this one, instead of having young players like Tony Williams and Ron Carter, this had players of Hank's generation. Bobby Rosengarten on drums and the great Milt Hinton on bass. And these records, guys come into the studio for 6 hours, it can go any way. This time magic happened. These 3 guys really clicked, and the session is extraordinary. It opens with "Swonderful," and it just swinging, and it never lets up. But one thing that happened that was really remarkable at the session is that the producer asked if Hank would play a solo piece. And he chose an arrangement that he had just created of Rodgers and Hammerstein's "Oh, What a Beautiful Morning," a piece that I think most people would find impossible to even imagine as a viable jazz property. And he played this exquisite arrangement, and then he goes into this marvelous improvisation. It's like a fantasia on the chords. Creative, far-reaching, melodically, goes way past, and then he just brings it right back home into the out chorus. It's 3-4 minutes, I think, not much longer than that. And it's just one of those miraculous moments of perfection, of which there are more in Hank Jones's discography than there are for most. So it is a great honor and a pleasure for me to introduce one of the great figures in jazz history, Hank Jones.